Hello and welcome to this week's Human Rights in Russia interview. I'm Mary Page, and today our guest is Vanessa Kogan. Since 2009, the executive director of Stichting Justice Initiative, a strategic litigation non-governmental organization that provides representation at the European Court of Human Rights for victims of human rights violations in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Stichting's lawyers give legal assistance to thousands of people litigating enforced disappearances, torture, and gender-based violence, and winning over 250 cases at the European Court, setting some important precedents as well. Just about a year ago, on December 2nd, 2020, Russian migration authorities annulled Vanessa Kogan's residence permit, and she was subsequently forced to leave the country. Prior to joining Stichting Justice Initiative, Vanessa worked in the legal office of Human Rights Watch in New York as a junior researcher with Fidesz in Paris and as a fellow at a refugee rights organization in southern France. She's studied literature and law in the US and the UK. Thank you for joining us, Vanessa, and sharing your perspectives and experiences. I have a series of questions to structure our half hour together. So if you're ready, let's get started.
Thank you. I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. So what has been the main area of work of the Justice Initiative that you head?
So the organization was founded initially as a response to massive and grave violations of human rights that were taking place in the North Caucasus region, particularly in Chechnya, during the Second Chechen conflict. Which began at the end of the 90s. So this was when Russia decided to wrest back control from the region that had established basically de facto independence. And so there were violations that occurred during this armed conflict, such as enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. Also, many civilians suffered due to indiscriminate attacks, uses of force by government authorities. And the organization came about because there were, of course, people documenting these abuses on the ground and coming into contact with victims and their family members who wanted to seek justice and were quite active about it. So, we're going around submitting complaints, going to the prosecutor's office, to the investigators, looking for their loved ones and not getting any satisfactory responses. And so at that time, Russia had recently ratified the European Convention on Human Rights in 1998. And a group of lawyers decided that it would be possible to try and bring these violations to be addressed by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And that's how the organization got started. And that was in the year 2001. And since then, the organization has kept a focus on grave human rights violations that happen in conflict or post-conflict. So we worked on, we started working on similar kinds of abuses in counterterrorism operations that happened in the wider region of the North Caucasus, so not only in Chechnya, but Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria. We also worked on the conflicts that occurred in Georgia and South Ossetia, in Ukraine. That work is currently ongoing. And we started then a new area of work starting at about 2015 onwards, where we branched into gender-based violence in Russia. And we started that work in the North Caucasus, but where there's I guess you could say that gender discrimination is particularly entrenched. It's a very patriarchal region. And there's been a resurgence of customary law and even an import of Sharia law that has had really devastating effects on women's rights and on children's rights in the region. But of course, there are also endemic problems with gender-based violence in Russia as a whole, including the fact that there is no domestic violence legislation. And so we've worked a lot in that area as well since 2015. So those are our two main areas now, the human rights and armed conflict and gender-based violence.
So could you tell us what happened to bring about the refusal of the Russian authorities to extend your residence permit? Was there a specific incident?
Well, I mean, the specific event that spurred on this decision, so the reason why it happened exactly in December 2020 and not later than that, was that I applied for Russian citizenship in September 2020 because I had lived in Russia for going on 11 years, and my husband and children had Russian citizenship, and we had plans, as you know, families do, to invest more money in our apartment and looking for a summer home. And of course, I was always also, you know, we were concerned to sort of shore up as much stability as we could in the country, given the way the political situation was developing, given the increased pressure due to our work. We wanted to, you know, first feel that we were on firmer footing in terms of, you know, all of the plans that we had in our personal lives, but also just feeling that we would have more stability if I also had a Russian passport, given the work that we were doing. But I don't think that, you know, if I hadn't applied for citizenship, I don't think that my situation would be that much different. In fact, it might be happening right now because I would have had to renew my long-term residence permit anyway this year. And so, you know, when you reapply for a residence permit, it goes through a similar review, I think, in the security services, especially given that I have an American passport. So it would have, I think, reached some of the same people who would have decided that it was time for me to go.
Mm-hmm. And how has this affected the work of your organization?
Of course, it's affected the organization's work in the sense that it's much more difficult for me now that I've left Russia to play a really active role in the organization's leadership. And so, of course, this has, we can say, has been a major distraction for the organization, deciding how it will move forward, what kind of leadership structure it needs, and addressing, of course, a vacuum in leadership in Russia and a vacuum in security for staff. Because while I was director in Russia, I was sort of, well, and I was, I think, considered sort of a first line of defense, right, as any director would be. And that's very much, I think, how the Russian authorities work in terms of analyzing organizations and sort of where their vulnerabilities are. So they're looking not only at legal entities, but also following the individuals who work in those organizations. And so I've been removed, and now, of course, one of our major concerns is who might be next of our staff in Russia. So that's a paramount concern for us at the moment.
And are the lawyers that work with you at the European Court, do they continue their work?
Yes, they do, and it would be it would be really catastrophic to have to drop the cases that we have started at the European Court, because we have over 150 cases pending at the European Court of Human Rights, and to drop these cases completely essentially would be to leave victims without any legal representation. So above all, regardless of what happens to a particular person, if they have to leave the country due to security cases, and continuing our legal representation, of course, remains our paramount priority.
Mm-hmm. So the Russian authorities have a whole area of measures that they use against civil society organizations. The foreign agent law, the laws on undesirable foreign organizations, and also the legislation on extremism and even terrorism. Which, if any of these laws, were applied to Stichting, your organization?
Well, the Justice Initiative is a foreign entity. And there's one piece of legislation that you left out, actually, which was one of the first that was applied to us, which well, it's also the law relating to the law on NGOs, but relating to the foreign NGOs. Because there were legislative amendments that were undertaken, I believe, in 2006, that made it much easier to sort of get rid of foreign organizations in Russia. Although, of course, when we remember back to that time, it seems like a paradise compared to now. But in 2011, the branch office of the Justice Initiative was struck out of the list of foreign NGOs allowed to operate in Russia. And that was due to a technicality, and that we hadn't submitted a report on time to the Ministry of Justice. And we tried to re-register the branch office, I believe it was 4 times, but we're not successful in doing so. Again, it was always on some kind of technical grounds. And so we began to work through a partner organization, a Russian organization, in order to ensure our sustainability and sort of transfer over our legal cases to that NGO. And we also have worked with a partner organization, a different partner organization in the North Caucasus ever since we began our work in 2001. And in terms of the legislation that you mentioned, the office, particularly in the North Caucasus, has been put in the Foreign Agents Registry. And so they are subjected to, I would say, crippling inspections by all different agencies, sort of that one after the other. I mean, I'm not sure that the being put in the Foreign Agents Registry actually, I'm not sure it changed much in terms of the inspections regime, because the office is already being inspected sort of all year round. Mm-hmm. But it definitely, in that particular region, increases the kind of stigma around the organization. So, and it's a very sort of insular community where everyone knows each other, and to have this kind of stigma attached to your organization and to, for example, the director himself, that's been very, very damaging reputationally. The Moscow-based NGO partner organization that we began working with after the branch office was no longer allowed to operate has recently been forced to liquidate by the Ministry of Justice. And this was, in some ways, I mean, after I had to leave Russia, I was the former director of that NGO. After I had to leave Russia, it's not an entirely unexpected move by the ministry, but of course it does seem to us particularly draconian, again, because it was essentially on a technicality. The ministry alleges that we submitted documents for inclusion in the Federal Registry that were signed by the NGO's founder when she was not technically in Russia. And so, obviously this is to us seems like a technical ground. Even if it was a mistake, we could be fined or warned, but instead the ministry is asked immediately to liquidate the organization. And of course, what's really worrying in this situation is that we know that we've looked at the materials in the case file, and we've seen that the ministry has already referred the matter to the investigative committee on charges potentially of falsification of documents. So, and that would, mean the direct criminal liability potentially of the new director of the organization. So that's the most worrying aspect here. Of course, we don't want the organization to be liquidated, but we're, really concerned for our staff. So that's incredibly worrying. So those are the main challenges we're facing at the moment. In terms of our situation in Russia.
So are these pressures on you and your organization similar to those experienced by other human rights organizations in Russia, or are they different?
Oh, they're certainly similar in many ways, different in others. I mean, I think one of the main ways that we're protected in relation to other organizations is that we are fairly well established. We've been in the country for a long time. We have a stable base of funding and support. And so we are, of course, much better able to withstand this pressure and to sort of rise each time from the ashes, so to say. Where I think organizations that are hit with this kind of with these kinds of campaigns and attacks, where it really hurts, is of course those organizations that are much smaller and less well funded, that are usually in the regions where you not only have this legislation, but you have very one can say sort of opportunistic use of this legislation. And that, I think, is really how this legislation has been used to cripple civil society, because it is usually possible to, if you have a certain level of funding and support, to essentially to find a way to keep operating. But for organizations on the local level that are not as well known, and that have local officials that may have in this legislation found exactly what they needed supposedly to try and intimidate the director of the organization, or get the organization to change its mandate or its charter, to weaken it. Those are the kinds of things that we see that have really weakened civil society locally, on the local level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so thinking about the way that the people in the US learn about what's going on in Russia, the media tends to be pretty gloomy about human rights and the state of civil society in general in Russia. And to what extent do you think that gloomy picture is justified, or are there places of light?
Well, it's understandably gloomy, I think, when you look at the trajectory that Russia has followed since the beginning of the pandemic, or even I would say maybe since the protests of summer 2019. That there doesn't seem to have, that usually in the past, when there were repressive actions taken, there was then a sort of a little break and a bit of breathing room, and maybe a few sort of symbolic gestures to show that it wasn't that there was some kind of reprieve. But there's been nothing like that for quite a while now, and so and there's a huge exodus now also of human rights defenders that are threatened, and and then of course we have Belarus also looking to Russia's closest neighbor. Obviously, Russia had a huge role to play in the evolution of the protests in Belarus and the survival of Lukashenko. And so, I think that everyone is looking to this scenario as sort of the potential endgame for Russia's continued policy on human rights. And so, it doesn't look like there's any light at the end of the tunnel right now. So I think that, in terms of what we would think of the recognized human rights movement in Russia, these are dark days. But at the same time, of course, there are some really interesting things going on that we don't hear about that often. And one example is that there are a lot of organizations that are experimenting now, and quite successfully, with domestic resource mobilization on the local level. And that, of course, has been a really, I think, underappreciated and under supported movement, which is, obviously it would be a real way out for many organizations that want to continue operating, but they don't want to be foreign agents, and they don't want to be persecuted for receiving foreign funding. And then, of course, it's also a great way and an appropriate way, probably a bit late, belated way, but it's better late than never, to really connect with local constituencies. And so there are organizations that we know of. For example, we had a rather large project with the European Commission where we were able to subgrant funds to organizations that had been selected by community panelists. And we had several organizations actually refuse quite generous grants because they did not want to accept foreign funding. They knew that they would be persecuted for it, and they had enough funding. The key is that they had enough funding that they were raising locally from their own constituents. So it's of course a shame that they couldn't accept further funding to promote their mission, but very encouraging that they had this kind of support to fund their organizations.
For sure. So looking to the future, kind of far ahead in the future, I mean, how do you see human rights in Russia sort of in the next decade?
Yeah, well, it's of course, it's hard to say because, I mean, now what we had last year with the constitutional amendments that Putin ensured were passed such that he could run for 2 more terms as president, doesn't leave that much room for an optimistic prognosis in the next decade, I would say, because obviously we can see what the plans are, that this political regime should remain in place. And so, unfortunately, I think that it looks like there's going to be sort of a continuing movement of human rights defenders from Russia moving abroad, and continuing their work from abroad. So sort of looking a little bit like, I guess, the 70s and 80s looked like near the end of the Soviet Union, when you had a huge dissident movement outside the country that was trying to influence the situation within the country. And I think that is really the direction that we'll be moving in the short term, most likely. And I think a lot of it also depends on, whether or not, because Russia has talked a lot about this sovereign internet, that they want to build a sovereign internet like China. And so far they haven't been successful. Though, of course, they have started blocking a lot of websites, but there's still ways to get around it. It's not a real threat yet to freedom of information, although, of course, it's starting to be. But the question will remain, how successful they might be doing that. How much access will people still have to free information, to finding out about government abuses, and how will people who are outside the country be able to ensure protection of victims in the country, victims of human rights abuses. That's the biggest question, I think, of course, because, and there will be people who will come, who, younger people that will rise to the challenge, but they'll, of course, have less protection than those who find themselves now, in the international spotlight outside of the country. So, I think there will be this continuing movement outside of the country. And and that's sort of the short to medium term prognosis, unfortunately, in my opinion.
So that leads to my final question, which is, if you would be able to just say a few words about how it has been for you to relocate your family on such short notice.
Well, it's very difficult, of course. Because we had a real ecosystem, a real life set up in Russia, and my partner, this was actually his second forced expulsion, because he originally came from Uzbekistan and grew up in Uzbekistan and was a human rights lawyer in Uzbekistan, and was no longer able to continue his work there in 2006 and moved to Russia. And now, unfortunately, the same thing essentially has happened to him, even though he can go back to Russia, but obviously his family can't. So that was, of course, it's a personal tragedy, for him and his family, where he has relatives. this essentially, this restriction on the right to residence, essentially. And, for our children, I think too, it's been very difficult, but children are very resilient. So that's something we're very grateful for. So there's still a hope that at some point they'll be able to go back. I'll be able to go back. And I mean, looking back on this year, it's been, of course, very difficult, but we've had a lot of support, and not everyone has had the same kind of support that we've had. So I think, it's been very difficult for us, and yet we're in a very privileged position to have, been able to come and get set up relatively quickly. And I know that there are many people who are forced to make a decision to leave the country who don't have that kind of support. And so I feel for them, because I know how hard it is when you have the support. So without it, I think it's obviously doubly difficult.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time together. But I want to thank you so much for spending part of this Thanksgiving Day with Rights in Russia, and for sharing your insights on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia, and on your own situation as well. Best wishes for the upcoming holiday season, and I hope we'll have occasion for further discussion in the new year. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Happy Thanksgiving.